We begin our proceedings in a rather wide angle. The tale I wish to recount in this keynote address goes to the heart of some of the challenges currently facing the European Union. It is a tale of how a set of assumptions were elevated to the level of self-evident truths and pursued to a point where good things turn sour or rather stale. When we look back upon the process that has led to the forming of the Common Foreign and Security Policy and its defense dimension, the CSDP, one cannot avoid noting the fact that while all agree that the EU should have such policies, there has been much or very little thought going into what these policies should be about. I wish in this regard to use liberal internationalism as a conceptual lens, as a concept that embraces the key tenets of EU foreign policy without being cumbersomely rigid. There is no canonical description of liberalism. What we tend to call liberal more closely resembles a family portrait of shared assumptions, principles, and institutions recognizable by certain characteristics. For example, a commitment to individual freedom, government through democratic representation, rights of property, and equality of opportunity, etc., which most liberal states share, although none have perfected them all. The EU came into fruition at what we might call a golden age of liberalism, and unsurprisingly, let the ideational vacuum at its core be filled with the spirit of an age. To remind you, we have lived through a period of remarkable expansion. World average GDP per capita that stood at around $1,000 in year 1900 is around 6,000 today. The world population has increased sevenfold since year 1800 until today, when it currently stands at 7.2 billion. Technology has advanced in leaps and bounds. The same species that took 1,500 years to advance from bronze to iron tools have only used 7 decades from the first computers to the mobile phones that you now have in your pockets. The world has also grown more peaceful, and it might not seem so, but at least according to Harvard scholar Steven Pinker, violence has been declining, at least on a per capita basis. And this ranges from corporal punishment to the abuse of children and to war. The period has also been marked by a great expansion of international cooperation and a quest for supranational solutions to international problems. According to the Union of International Organizations, there are some 65,000 international organizations in the world today, and the European Union is by far the most wide-ranging and effective of them all. And at the core of all these trends, liberal policies seem to be the common denominator. Since the 1990s, the late 1990s, the EU has accrued its own distinctive brand of liberal internationalism, centered on the expansion of what they call European values, a term the EU has never made the mistake of defining. When we look at the sum of EU foreign policies, we see a heterogeneous blend of foreign aid, declamation, diplomacy, accession proceedings, and crisis management. While the EU's High Representative has been absent from many of the great issues of our day, a great many second and third tier concerns have benefited from EU engagement. Unspectacular, to be sure, but sometimes rather effective, not least in the ongoing negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo, where Federica Mogherini is building on the excellent work begun by Robert Cooper. That said, it's not entirely clear that the sum total of these discrete initiatives does warrant the grand term foreign policy. Let me now give a couple of thoughts as to what liberal internationalism means in an EU context as I see it. To my mind, EU liberal internationalism has four cornerstones, and I'm trying to be as precise as possible here. The first is a belief that democracy, market economy, the rule of law, and human rights are so sticky that if a state accepts one of them, the three others will surely follow. This would lead to liberal democracy as Europe's preferred form of government. The other idea was the notion of economic interdependence as key to economic growth and peace. Integration would make borders less relevant and necessitate supranational governance. This assumption was based on the fact that democracies rarely go to war against each other, as is illustrated by the European case. A third factor was technology optimism, i.e. a belief that new technology would solve challenges as they arise. These have been the years when the internet revolution have promoted prosperity, openness, and innovation on a scale the world has not seen since the Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s. A fourth idea, a kind of insurance policy, was the certainty that an over-powerful United States stood ready to enforce the liberal order in Europe if need be. These four assumptions have translated into three tenets on which, according to politics professor Walter Russell Mead, most Western policy elites agree. The first is that the rise of a liberal capitalist and more or less democratic and law-based international order is both unavoidable and irreversible. The second is that the Davos elite, the financiers, the politicians, the intellectuals, journalists, and technocrats who manage the great enterprises, institutions, and politics of the contemporary world, I guess you guys, know what they are doing and are competent to manage the system they represent. The third is that no serious alternative exists to the Davos perspective. Our establishment believes in its gut that Davos has and always will have both might and right on its side. So, the four concepts of EU liberal internationalism has, as of late, run into trouble. The rise of liberal democracies in Russia and perhaps Hungary belies the stickiness assumption. The benign impact of interdependence has been belied by the EU response to the refugee crisis, where beggar thy neighbor policies have flourished despite the EU's insistence on sharing the negative harvest of globalization. Technology seems less of a panacea given the inability to halt the rise of the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq. Also, in recent times, EU foreign policies, albeit some of them not under the aegis of the CFSP, have landed the EU in hot water. One was the offer of an accession agreement to Ukraine, which started a cascade of events which led to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the fermentation of separatism in eastern Ukraine. The EU have agreed on sanctions, but its policies seems currently to have led to little more than the formation of yet another frozen conflict on Europe's borders. Ukraine has not been offered EU membership as one might have expected, and will likely not be for the foreseeable future. Likewise, the Syrian question, EU policies have for 6 years been more concerned with the purity of the means than whether they actually achieve the desired ends. The EU has been unforgivably slow to realize that the preferred policies of foreign aid, asylum, and dialogue does little or nothing to stop the actual war. One might also fault EU foreign policy elite for failing to realize the stream of refugees to Europe that would ensue if the war was allowed to carry on for years. On the operational level, the track record shows that the EU's effectiveness is hampered by what Chris Hill many years ago dubbed the capability expectations gap. And this gap has primarily three components, namely the ability to agree, resources availability, and the instruments at the EU's disposal. 2 out of 3 have been, well, if not completely met, then at least bettered, and that is the question of resources and instruments. The EU has made great progress on this score, but there remains a key shortfall when it comes to the absence of an effective decision-making mechanism. Recent events point to this question might being overcome. Federica Mogherini has announced that next year, in June, we will have an updated EU security strategy, a EU global strategy for foreign and security policy. They really are not afraid of hyperbole. That the pressure to resolve the refugee crisis also led ministers to use the political nuclear option of qualified majority voting to adopt a relocation scheme. The voting mechanism is common for less controversial measures, but has never been used for something as sensitive and divisive as refugee relocation. Perhaps this may also become the new way of the CFSP. If that happens, it will not be without opposition. A grand struggle lies ahead, and perhaps a struggle the likes of which the integrated European Union has never seen before. It will pit nation states against institutions and populations against governments. It will be fought over issues such as the British referendum, the handling of the refugee crisis, and the dealings with Russia. No one knows what will be gained and what will be lost in the struggle that lies ahead. It is possible that the current crisis will be the springboard to a more deeply integrated post-national Europe. It is also possible that it will prove fracturing and that the member states of the European Union may be split into camps of mutual distrust. Or perhaps voters will force a new political paradigm to replace that of liberal internationalism, which, at least when it comes to the refugee crisis, seems to have created a crisis it seems incapable of solving. That were my remarks. Thank you very much.